Welcome back to HOA Rulebook. I thought it would be a warning. It was a cover-up. I am standing in my own driveway in Spokane, Washington, and Heather Evans is 6 inches from my face screaming that I parked my work van illegally. I did not. I know I did not. The drizzle is soaking through my tan jacket, my white baseball cap is dripping, and I keep glancing at my watch because I have a client appointment in 40 minutes, and this woman will not stop yelling. She waves a laminated sheet in my face like it is a warrant and says, "You violated Section 4.7, subsection C, and I can fine you daily until you give up and you cry." I run a mobile detailing business. I depend on my driveway. If I lose access, I lose my income. That is the stakes. She knows it. That is why she is here. Heather is the Community Standards Chair for the Ironwood Trails HOA, and she has been inventing guidelines on the fly since the day she took the job. She is wearing a pink windbreaker and a red bucket hat, and she has a roll of caution tape hanging from her belt like she is about to cordon off a crime scene. Behind her, a tow truck idles at the curb. The driver is leaning against the door, arms crossed, watching us. An orange cone lies knocked on its side near the mailbox. A teenager on a bike has braked hard at the corner, 1 foot on the pavement, staring at us like we are a street fight. I keep my voice calm and say, "Show me the violation notice." She shoves a printed sheet at me, and I see the date is today. No warning, no courtesy period, just a fine and a tow threat. I say, "When did you send the warning?" She says, "I do not need to send a warning. I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized." That line sits in my chest like a stone. I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized. I have heard that before. I pull out my phone and take a picture of the notice, and Heather steps closer and says, "That will not help you." I say, "We will see." She turns and walks back to the tow truck, and I watch her lean in the window and point at my van. The driver nods. I glance at my watch again. 38 minutes. I need this resolved now, or I lose the client and the referral chain that comes with it. I call the HOA management company. The line rings 4 times, and a woman answers with the name of the company. I say, "This is about Ironwood Trails. I have a violation notice dated today with no prior warning, and there's a tow truck in my driveway right now." She puts me on hold. The drizzle is getting heavier. My jacket is soaked. The tow driver is out of the truck now, walking toward my van with a clipboard. The management rep comes back and says, "I see a complaint filed this morning at 7:14 a.m. I say, "What was the complaint?" She says, "Unauthorized commercial vehicle parked in violation of community standards." I say, "My van is under the weight limit. It is not a box truck, and I have been parking it here for 2 years without a single issue." She says, "The complaint references a new interpretation of the guidelines." I feel my jaw tighten. I say, "Who filed the complaint?" She says, "I cannot disclose that." I say, "Was it Heather Evans?" Silence. Then she says, "I cannot confirm or deny." I hang up and walk over to the tow driver. I say, "Do you have the work order?" He hands me a printed sheet. The request is logged at 7:22 a.m., 8 minutes after the complaint. The name on the request line is blank, but the signature at the bottom is Heather Evans, Community Standards Chair. I take a picture of the work order and hand it back. I say, "You are not towing my van." He shrugs and says, "I go by what the HOA tells me." I say, "The HOA does not own my driveway." He says, "The HOA pays me, so I follow their call." Heather is back now, standing next to him, and she says, "You have 15 minutes to move the van off the property or it gets towed to the impound lot and you pay the fees." I say, "This is my property." She says, "The HOA covenants say I can enforce community standards. and your van is a commercial eyesore. I say, show me where it says that. She taps the laminated sheet and says, right here. I lean in and read it. The clause says commercial vehicles over 10,000 pounds are prohibited. My van is under 8,000 pounds. I point that out. She says, the board voted to update the interpretation last month. I say, show me the minutes. She says, they are not posted yet. That is the moment I know something is wrong. Minutes are supposed to be posted within 10 days of a meeting. The last meeting was 6 weeks ago, and there is nothing on the portal. I have checked. I say, when was the vote? She says, you were not there, so it does not matter. I say, I was not notified. She says, you have portal access. That is notification. I pull up the portal on my phone right there in the driveway and show her the meeting calendar. The last entry is April. It is now late June. She glances at it and says, that is a technical issue, not my problem. The tow driver is attaching the hook now. I say, stop. He does not stop. I call 911. The dispatcher asks what the emergency is. I say someone is trying to tow my vehicle without legal cause. She says a deputy will be out. Heather laughs and says, you think the cops care about HOA business. I say, we will see. The deputy arrives 12 minutes later. By then, the van is hooked and the driver is waiting for clearance to pull it. The deputy is a calm older man with gray at his temples, and he asks what is going on. I explain the timeline. No warning. Immediate fine. Tow ordered within 8 minutes of the complaint, and the violation does not match the actual rule. Heather interrupts and says, he is in violation of community standards. I have the authority to enforce. And this is HOA business, not a police matter. The deputy asks to see the covenants. Heather hands him the laminated sheet. He reads it and says, this says over 10,000 pounds. He looks at my van and says, that does not look over 10,000 pounds. I say, it is not. Heather says, the board updated the interpretation. The deputy says, do you have the updated rule in writing? Heather says, it is in the minutes, which are not posted yet. The deputy looks at me and says, do you have proof the rule was not updated? I say, the portal shows no meetings since April. He nods and says to Heather, you need to provide written proof of the updated rule before you can tow this vehicle. Heather's face goes red. She says, I do not need to prove anything to you. The deputy says, if you want to tow his vehicle, you do. She says, this is HOA business. You have no jurisdiction. He says, this is a civil dispute on private property, and I am here to keep the peace. If you cannot show written proof of the rule change, the tow does not happen. Heather turns to the tow driver and says, do it anyway. The driver looks at the deputy. The deputy says, if you tow that vehicle without legal cause, the owner can file charges for theft. The driver unhooks the van and drives away. Heather is shaking with rage. She says to me, you just made this so much worse for yourself. I ask the deputy if I can get an incident report number. He writes it down and hands it to me. I thank him. Heather storms off toward her car, and I hear her say under her breath, I can fine you daily until you give up. And you cry. I stand there in the drizzle and realize I just bought myself time, but not a solution. Heather is going to escalate. I can feel it. I check my watch. I am late for the client. I text an apology and reschedule. Then I sit in my van and think. The missing meeting minutes. The backdated notice. The instant tow order. This is not random. This is coordinated. I pull up the HOA portal on my phone and scroll back through the history. April meeting. Routine budget discussion. March meeting. Landscaping contract renewal. February meeting. Nothing. January meeting. Nothing. I keep scrolling. December, a special meeting notice, but no minutes posted. November, same thing. I count 6 meetings over the last 8 months with no posted minutes. That is a violation of the HOA bylaws. The bylaws say minutes must be posted within 10 business days. I screenshot every missing entry. Then I do something I should have done 2 years ago. I file a formal records request. The request form is on the portal, buried under 3 menus. I fill it out and ask for copies of all meeting minutes from the last 12 months, all violation notices issued in my name, and all complaints filed against my property. The form has a drop-down for delivery method. I choose certified mail with tracking. The bylaws say the HOA has 15 business days to respond. I submit the request and get an auto-confirmation email. Then I open a new document on my phone and start a timeline. 7:14 a.m. Complaint filed. 7:22 a.m. Tow ordered. 9:43 a.m. Deputy stops the tow. I add a note. Heather has access to the complaint system and the tow vendor. She is either filing complaints herself or someone is feeding them to her instantly. I spend the rest of the day working. I reschedule the client for tomorrow and knock out 2 other jobs in the afternoon. When I get home, there is a thick envelope with a tracking label wedged in my mailbox. The label is turned away so I cannot read the tracking number, but I can see the certified mail sticker. I open it. Inside is a formal violation notice, printed on Ironwood Trails HOA letterhead, dated today and signed by Heather Evans. The violation is listed as failure to comply with community standards enforcement action. The fine is $150. The notice says I have 72 hours to pay or the fine doubles. There is no explanation of what I failed to comply with. I take pictures of every page. Then I call the management company again. This time a different rep answers. I explain the situation and ask if the violation is in the system. She puts me on hold. When she comes back, she says, I see the entry. Filed at 4:11 p.m. today. I say, what is the basis? She says, non-compliance with enforcement directive. I say, what directive? She says, you will need to contact the board. I say, I want to speak to a supervisor. She says, the regional supervisor is only in town today and this is my one chance to get eyes on the file. I say, then let me speak to them. She says, they are in meetings until 5. I check my watch. It is 4:47. I say, I will wait. She puts me on hold again. I wait 11 minutes. Then a man's voice comes on and says his name and title. I explain the whole thing, the tow attempt, the missing minutes, the backdated notice, the instant complaint to enforcement pipeline, and the fact that I have filed a records request that has not been answered yet. He listens. Then he says, how long ago did you file the request? I say, this morning. He says, you have 15 business days. I say, I know, but I am being fined and threatened with towing while I wait, and that feels like retaliation. He says, I will look into it. I say, can you flag my account so no further enforcement actions happen until the records request is fulfilled? He pauses. Then he says, I can note that you have an open dispute. I say, that is not the same thing. He says, it is what I can do. I thank him and hang up. That night I cannot sleep. I keep thinking about the missing minutes. If Heather is manipulating the system, she is not doing it alone. Someone at the management company is helping her, or someone on the board is covering for her. I get up and open my laptop. I log into the HOA portal and go to the board directory. There are 5 board members: Heather Evans, Community Standards Chair; Ron Kimball, President; Sandra Yee, Treasurer; 2 others listed as at-large members. I click on the meeting archive. The posted minutes go back 3 years, but there are gaps. Big gaps. I start comparing the meeting calendar to the posted minutes. In the last 3 years, there should be 36 monthly meetings. Only 22 have posted minutes. 14 are missing. I make a spreadsheet and list every missing date. Then I notice something. Every missing meeting happened during a month when there was a major rules change or a budget vote. December 2022, landscaping contract. June 2023, parking rule update. November 2023, special assessment. March 2024, towing vendor contract. Every single one. I save the spreadsheet and email it to myself. Then I do something risky. I email Ron Kimball, the HOA president, and ask if he can explain why so many meeting minutes are missing. I keep the tone polite and say I am trying to understand the records process. I hit send at 11:32 p.m. I do not expect a response until morning, but my phone buzzes at 11:41 p.m. It is Ron. He says, "The minutes are posted when the secretary has time to finalize them. Some meetings take longer to document." I reply and say, "The bylaws say 10 business days." He says, "We do our best." I say, 14 meetings over 3 years is a pattern, not a backlog. He does not reply. The next morning, I get an email from the management company. The subject line says Records Request Update. I open it. The message says, "Your request has been received and is being processed. Due to the volume of records, we may need additional time beyond the standard 15 business days. If you have concerns, please contact the board directly." I screenshot the email and reply immediately. I say, "The bylaws do not allow extensions without a written explanation of the delay." I cite the specific section. I hit send. No reply. I call the management company. The line rings and rings. No one picks up. I try again an hour later. Same thing. I try the regional supervisor's direct line. Voicemail. I leave a message and say I need a status update on my records request and I am being stonewalled. By noon, I have a new problem. I go outside to check the mail and find a neon orange notice zip-tied to my mailbox post. The notice says "Final Warning" in bold letters at the top. The body of the notice says I have 24 hours to pay the $150 fine or face a lien on my property. It is signed by Heather Evans. I take a picture and pull the notice off the post. A neighbor is walking past, an older man named Carl, and he stops and says, "What is that about?" I show him the notice. He reads it and says, "Heather did this." I say, "You know her." He says, "Everyone knows her. She has been going after people for 2 years. My buddy got hit with a fine for a mailbox that did not match the approved style, even though the approved style list does not exist." I say, "What happened?" He says, "He paid it because he did not want the hassle." I say, "Did he ever get the approved list?" Carl shakes his head and says, "Nope. She just moved on to someone else." Carl says, "You should talk to Linda Marsh. She fought Heather last year and won." I say, "Who is Linda?" He says, "She lives 2 streets over. She is the one who brought the actual printed covenants to a meeting and read them out loud when Heather tried to fine her for a fence color. Heather backed down because the covenants do not have a fence color rule." I say, "Can you give me her number?" Carl says, I will text it to you. He pulls out his phone and sends it right there. I thank him and walk back inside. I call Linda. She picks up on the second ring. I introduce myself and explain what is happening. She listens and then says, Heather is doing the same thing she did to me. She files complaints under other people's names, backdates notices, and manipulates the portal so you cannot prove what happened when. I say, how do you know? She says, because I caught her. Linda says, last year I got a violation notice for my fence. The notice said the color was not approved. I checked the covenants. There is no fence color rule. I went to the next board meeting and brought a printed copy of the covenants. I stood up during public comment and read the fence section out loud. Heather tried to cut me off and said the covenants were outdated and the board had voted to update them. I asked for the updated version. She could not produce it. Ron Kimball, the president, admitted there was no vote. Heather had been enforcing a rule that did not exist. The board rescinded the fine on the spot. I say, what happened to Heather? Linda says, nothing. She is still on the board. But after that, she stopped going after me. She moved on to other people. I say, did you file a complaint? Linda says, with who? The board protects her. The management company does what the board says. Unless you have hard proof, you are just making noise. I say, I am working on the proof. Linda says, good. If you need a witness or someone to show up at a meeting, call me. I will be there. I thank her and hang up. Then I sit down and think. Linda said Heather files complaints under other people's names. That means the complaint log is fake. If I can get a copy of the log and cross-check it with the homeowners, I can prove Heather is forging entries. But I need the log first. I open the records request response email and reply again. I say, I am adding a request for the full complaint log for my property, including timestamps, IP addresses, and submitter information. I cite the data transparency clause in the bylaws. I send it. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA drama and justice served. 3 days pass. No response from the management company, no follow-up from Ron Kimball, no movement on the records request. But I do get another notice. This one is hand-delivered. I open the door one morning and find Heather standing on my porch holding a clipboard. She is wearing the pink windbreaker and red bucket hat again, and she has the caution tape looped over her shoulder. She says, "You have failed to pay the fine." I say, "I am disputing it." She says, "Disputes do not pause enforcement." I say, "Show me where it says that." She taps the clipboard and says, "Right here." I lean in and look. The page is a printout of a policy I have never seen before. The header says Ironwood Trails HOA Enforcement Procedures. The section she is pointing to says, "Fines must be paid within 72 hours regardless of dispute status. Failure to pay results in escalation to collections and a lien filing." I take a picture of the page. Heather steps back and says, "You are now in collections. Your account has been referred to our attorney. Expect a lien notice within 10 days. I say, "You cannot file a lien for a disputed fine." She says, "I just did." I say, "I will fight it." She says, "Good luck. You are going to need it. I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized." She turns and walks down the driveway. I watch her get into a golf cart parked at the curb. She drives off slowly, turning her head to stare at my house as she passes. I take a video of the whole thing. Then I go inside and call an attorney. I find one who specializes in HOA disputes. His name is Greg Tanaka. He listens to my story and asks if I have documentation. I say, I have photos, videos, emails, and a records request that has not been answered. He says, that is a good start. He asks if I have proof the fines are bogus. I say, not yet, but I am working on it. He says the lien filing will take at least 2 weeks. Use that time to gather everything you can. If you can prove selective enforcement or procedural violations, we can block the lien and possibly go after the board for abuse of authority. I ask how much it will cost. He says, I charge $300 an hour, but I will do a free consult and review your evidence before you commit. I say, deal? I hang up and go back to work. Over the next week, I gather everything I can. I screenshot every email. I save every notice. I make copies of the timeline, the spreadsheet of missing minutes, and the records request correspondence. I also start asking neighbors. I knock on doors and ask if anyone has had issues with Heather or the HOA. Most people say no. A few say yes but do not want to get involved. One couple, a young family 2 streets over, says they got fined last year for parking a moving truck in their driveway for 1 day. The fine was $200. They paid it because they did not want trouble. I ask if they have the notice. They say no. They threw it away. I ask if they remember the date. They say it was in September. I write it down. Then I get a break. I am checking the HOA portal one night and notice something strange. The complaint log page has a drop-down menu for date range. I select all time and hit search. The page loads and shows a list of complaints going back 3 years. I scroll through it. My name appears 7 times. 7 complaints. I recognize 2 of them, the van complaint from last week and a noise complaint from last month that I never heard about. The other 5 are all from before I filed the records request. I click on the oldest one. The complaint is dated March 2022. The description says, unauthorized outdoor storage of equipment. The submitter field says anonymous. The resolution field says, fine issued, $100. Paid. I have never received a fine for outdoor storage. I have never stored equipment outside. I screenshot the entry and click on the next one. Same thing, anonymous complaint, bogus violation, fine issued and marked paid. I go through all 7. 5 of them are marked paid. I have never paid any of them. I call Greg Tanaka immediately. It is 10 p.m. but he answers. I say, I found proof. I explain the fake complaint log entries. He says, that is huge. If the HOA is logging fines as paid when you never paid them, someone is pocketing the money or covering up fake enforcement. Either way, it is fraud. I say, what do I do? He says, print everything. File a formal complaint with the board and the management company. Copy the state HOA regulator and your county district attorney. Make noise. He says, also, do not pay any fines. If they try to file a lien, we will block it and countersue. I thank him and hang up. Then I spend 2 hours printing every document, screenshot, and email. I organize it all into a binder. The binder is 2 inches thick. I label it evidence. The next morning I drive to the management company office. It is in a strip mall on the north side of Spokane. I walk in and tell the receptionist I need to file a formal complaint. She says, you have to do that through the portal. I say, the portal is not working. She says, I can reset your password. I say, that is not the issue. I need to file a complaint in person because the system is being manipulated. She looks at me like I am crazy. I say, I have proof. I open the binder and show her the complaint log printouts with the fake entries. She glances at them and says, you need to talk to the regional supervisor. I say, great, where is he? She says, he is not in today. I say, when will he be in? She says, I do not know. I say, "Can I leave a written complaint?" She says, "I can take it." I pull out a typed letter I prepared last night. The letter lists every violation: missing minutes, fake complaints, backdated notices, fake paid fines, and retaliation for filing a records request. I hand it to her. She puts it in a folder and says, "Someone will follow up." I say, "When?" She says, "I cannot give you a timeline." I say, "That is not acceptable." She says, "I am sorry. That is all I can do." I leave the office and sit in my van. I am furious. I pull out my phone and call the county district attorney's office. I ask to speak to someone about HOA fraud. I get transferred 3 times. Finally, a woman in the Consumer Protection Division answers. I explain the situation. She listens and asks if I have filed a police report. I say, "No. The deputy who responded to the tow attempt told me it was a civil matter." She says, "If the HOA is logging fake fines and marking them paid, that is theft by deception. You should file a report." I say, "Will they investigate?" She says, "That depends on the evidence. If you have documentation, bring it to the sheriff's office and file a report. I can flag it for review." I thank her and hang up. I drive straight to the sheriff's office. I walk in and tell the desk deputy I want to file a report for fraud. He hands me a form. I fill it out and attach copies of the complaint log printouts, the fake fine notices, and the records request correspondence. The deputy reviews it and says, "This is pretty detailed." I say, "It is all real." He says, "I will forward it to investigations. Someone will contact you." I ask how long that will take. He says, "Could be a few days, could be a few weeks. Depends on the caseload." I say, "I have a lien threat hanging over me." He says, "You might want to talk to a lawyer." I say, "I already did." He nods and says, "Good." I leave the sheriff's office feeling like I am finally making progress, but I also know Heather is not going to stop. That afternoon, I get an email from the management company. The subject line says records request fulfillment. I open it. The message says, "Your records request has been fulfilled. Please see the attached documents." I download the attachment. It is a single PDF file, 47 pages long. I open it. The first page is a cover letter saying the records are complete and accurate as of the request date. The next page is a list of meeting minutes. Only 12 are included. I cross-check it against my spreadsheet. 14 meetings are still missing. The complaint log is included, but it only goes back 1 year, not 3 years like the portal showed. The violation notices are included, but only 2 are listed: the van complaint and the noise complaint. The 5 fake fines are not included. I read the cover letter again. It says the records are complete. They are not. I forward the email to Greg Tanaka and say, "They are hiding evidence." He replies in 10 minutes and says, "That is obstruction. File another complaint and demand a complete response. If they refuse, we file a motion to compel in court." I reply to the management company email and say, "This response is incomplete. I requested all meeting minutes from the last 12 months. 14 meetings are missing. I requested the full complaint log. Only 1 year is included. I requested all violation notices. 5 are missing. Please provide the complete records within 5 business days or I will pursue legal action." I copy Greg on the email and hit send. 2 days later, I get a response. The email is from Ron Kimball, the HOA president. He says, "Your repeated requests are becoming disruptive to HOA operations. The records provided are complete and accurate. If you have further concerns, you may address them at the next board meeting." The next meeting is scheduled for July 15 at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. I check the calendar. July 15 is 12 days away. I forward the email to Greg and say, "They are stalling." He replies and says, "Show up at the meeting. Bring your binder. Request to speak during public comment. If they try to shut you down, we will have grounds for a lawsuit." I say, "What if they do not let me speak?" He says, "Record everything. If they violate your rights, we will use it in court." I spend the next week preparing. I organize the binder into sections: missing minutes, fake complaints, fake fines, incomplete records response, timeline of retaliation. I print extra copies of the key documents. I rehearse what I am going to say. I call Linda Marsh and ask if she can come to the meeting as a witness. She says absolutely. I will be there. I also call Carl, the neighbor who told me about Linda. He says, "I will come too. You need a crowd." The more people who see this, the harder it is for them to ignore it. July 15 arrives. I get to the clubhouse at 6:45 p.m. The parking lot is half full. I walk inside and see about 20 people sitting in folding chairs facing a table at the front. The board members are already seated: Ron Kimball in the center, Sandra Yee to his left, Heather Evans to his right. The two at-large members are at the ends. Heather sees me and her face hardens. I sit in the back row. Linda walks in a minute later and sits next to me. Carl arrives and sits on my other side. At 7 p.m., Ron calls the meeting to order. He goes through the agenda, budget update, landscaping report, new business. Public comment is listed last. The budget discussion is boring. Sandra reads numbers from a spreadsheet. Heather interrupts and says one of the line items is wrong. Sandra says, "Which one?" Heather points at the screen and says, "That one." The amount is off by $300. Sandra says, "I will check the source file." Heather says, "You need to correct it now." Sandra says, "I cannot correct it now. I need to verify it." Heather says, "This is unacceptable. We cannot approve a budget with errors." Ron says, "We will table the budget vote until next month." Heather sits back, satisfied. I watch the whole thing and realize she just killed the budget discussion to buy time. I glance at Linda. She leans over and whispers. She does that every time someone asks a question she does not like. The landscaping report is quick. The new business section is empty. Ron says, "That brings us to public comment. If you wish to speak, please state your name and keep your remarks under 3 minutes." I stand up and walk to the front. I say, "My name is on file. I am here to address a pattern of enforcement abuse and records manipulation." Heather says, "This is not the time for personal grievances." Ron says, "Public comment is open to all topics." Heather glares at him. I open the binder and say, "I filed a records request on June 17. The bylaws require a response within 15 business days. I received a partial response on June 29, 12 days later, but it was incomplete. 14 meeting minutes are missing. The complaint log only covers 1 year instead of 3. 5 violation notices are not included. I requested a complete response on June 30. I have not received one." Ron says, "The records provided were complete." I say, "They are not." I hold up the spreadsheet and say, "This shows 14 meetings over 3 years with no posted minutes. Every one of those meetings involved a major rules change or budget vote. I requested minutes for all 12 months of the last year. Only 8 were provided." Ron says, "Some meetings do not have minutes because they were informal discussions." I say, The bylaws do not allow informal discussions. All board meetings must be documented. Ron says, "We do our best." I say, "Your best is not good enough." I turn to the room and say, "How many people here have received fines or notices that did not make sense?" 3 hands go up. I say, "How many of you checked the complaint log and found entries you did not recognize?" 1 hand stays up. I say, "That is because the log is fake." Heather stands up and says, "You are making serious accusations without proof." I say, "I have proof." I hold up the binder and say, "I have screenshots of the complaint log showing 7 complaints against my property. 5 of them are marked paid, but I never paid them. 2 of them are for violations that never happened." Heather says if you did not pay the fines, they would be in collections. I say, "Exactly. So either the log is fake or someone is pocketing the money. Which is it?" The room goes silent. Ron says, "This is not the appropriate forum for this discussion." I say, "When is the appropriate forum?" Ron says, "You can file a formal complaint with the management company." I say I already did. Twice. No response. Ron says, "Then you will need to pursue it through legal channels." I say I plan to. Heather says, "You are wasting everyone's time." I say, "I am exposing fraud." She says, "You are lying." I say, "I have the documents right here." She says, "Let me see them." I walk over and hand her the binder. She flips through it, and I see her face change. She is looking at the complaint log printouts. She sees the 5 fake entries. She closes the binder and says, "This proves nothing." I say, "It proves someone is filing fake complaints and marking them paid." She says, "Or, it proves you are bad at record keeping." I say, "The portal does not let homeowners edit the log. Only the board and the management company have access." She says, "Then it is a portal glitch." I say, "A glitch that only affects my account." Convenient. Ron says, "I think we have heard enough. Public comment is closed." I say, "I am not done." Ron says, "Your 3 minutes are up." I say, "You did not time me." He says, "I do not need to. Sit down." Linda stands up and says, "I would like to speak." Ron says, "Public comment is closed." Linda says, "You just closed it to shut him up." Ron says, "The meeting is adjourned." He stands up and walks out. Sandra and the at-large members follow. Heather stays in her seat, staring at me. I walk back to my chair and pick up the binder. Heather stands and says, "You just made a huge mistake." I say, "We will see." She walks out. The room empties. Linda and Carl walk out with me. Outside, Carl says, "That was brutal." Linda says, "But effective. You got her rattled." "Did you see her face when she looked at the binder?" I say, "I saw it." Carl says, "What happens now?" I say, "I wait for them to make the next move." Linda says, "Be careful." Heather does not lose quietly. I say, "I know." The next morning, I get a call from the management company. The regional supervisor is on the line. He says, "I reviewed your complaint and the meeting recording. I need to see your evidence in person. Can you come to the office today?" I say, "When?" He says, "I have an opening at 2 p.m. I say, "I will be there." I hang up and call Greg Tanaka. I say, "The supervisor wants to meet." Greg says, "Good. Bring everything. Record the meeting if you can." I say, "Will do." At 2 p.m., I walk into the management company office. The regional supervisor is waiting in a conference room. His name is Mark Chen. He is a calm, professional man in his 50s. He shakes my hand and says, "Show me what you have." I open the binder and walk him through every section. I show him the missing minutes spreadsheet. I show him the complaint log with the fake entries. I show him the incomplete records response. I show him the timeline of retaliation. I show him the emails from Ron and Heather. I show him the notices with the escalating threats. Mark listens and takes notes. When I finish, he says, "This is a serious problem." He says, "The missing minutes are a bylaws violation. The fake complaints are fraud. The incomplete records response is obstruction. The retaliation is illegal under state law." He says, "I am going to launch an internal investigation. I will need copies of everything you just showed me." I hand him a flash drive with all the files. He says, "I will also need to interview the board members. If your allegations are accurate, there will be consequences." I say, "What kind of consequences?" He says, "Board members can be removed. Fines can be refunded. The HOA can be fined by the state." I say, "What about criminal charges?" He says, "That is up to the district attorney." I leave the office feeling cautiously optimistic. But I also know Heather is not done. 2 days later, I get proof. I am working in my driveway when I see a golf cart coming down the street. It is Heather. She drives slowly past my house, stops, and stares at me for a full 10 seconds. Then she drives on. I pull out my phone and record the whole thing. She circles the block and drives past again. This time she stops and takes a picture of my van. I walk toward her and say, "Can I help you?" She says, "Just doing my rounds." I say, "This is the third time you have driven past in 10 minutes. She says, "I can drive wherever I want." I say, "This is harassment." She says, "Prove it." She drives off. That night, I file a harassment complaint with the sheriff's office. I include the video and a written statement. The desk deputy says, "We will add it to your case file." I say, "Is anyone working the case?" He says, "It has been assigned to a detective." I say, "When will they contact me?" He says, "When they are ready." I leave feeling frustrated. 3 days later, I get an email from Mark Chen. The subject line says investigation update. I open it. The message says, "I have completed interviews with the board and management staff. I have identified several procedural violations and evidence of selective enforcement. I am recommending the following actions. Heather Evans will be removed from the Community Standards Chair position effective immediately. All fines issued under her authority will be reviewed. Any fines found to be improperly issued will be refunded. The complaint log will be audited and corrected. Missing meeting minutes will be posted within 10 business days. The board will vote on these recommendations at an emergency meeting on July 22 at 7 p.m. You are welcome to attend." I read the email 3 times. Then I forward it to Greg Tanaka. He replies and says, "This is a win. Show up at the meeting and make sure they follow through." I reply to Mark and say, "Thank you. I will be there." July 22 arrives. I get to the clubhouse at 6:50 p.m. The parking lot is packed. Word has spread. I walk inside and see at least 50 people in the room. Linda and Carl are there. Several other neighbors I recognize are there. The board is seated at the front table. Heather is not there. Ron calls the meeting to order and says, "We have an emergency agenda item tonight." Mark Chen from the management company will present his findings. Mark stands and walks to the front. He has a thick folder in his hand. He opens it and reads a summary of the investigation. He says the investigation found evidence of procedural violations, selective enforcement, and records manipulation. Specifically, the Community Standards Chair filed multiple complaints without proper documentation, issued fines without board approval, and failed to maintain accurate records. As a result, I am recommending the immediate removal of Heather Evans from her position and a full refund of all fines issued under her authority. Ron says, the board will now vote. Sandra says, I vote yes. The two at-large members say yes. Ron says, the motion passes. Heather Evans is removed from the Community Standards Chair position effective immediately. All fines issued under her authority will be reviewed and refunded where appropriate. The complaint log will be audited and corrected. Missing meeting minutes will be posted within 10 business days. The room erupts in applause. I sit back and feel a wave of relief. Then the door at the back of the room slams open. Heather walks in. She is wearing the pink windbreaker and red bucket hat. She is holding a file cart piled high with folders. She says, this is a witch hunt. Ron says, Heather, you are no longer a board member. Heather says, you cannot remove me without a vote. Ron says, we just voted. Heather says, I was not notified. Ron says, you were notified by email this afternoon. Heather says, I never got it. Ron says, that is not our problem. Heather walks toward the front of the room, dragging the file cart behind her. She says, I have proof that every fine I issued was legitimate. She pulls a folder off the cart and waves it in the air. She says, this is the complaint log. It shows every complaint filed against every property in this neighborhood. She opens the folder and starts reading entries out loud. She says, March 2022, unauthorized outdoor storage. June 2022, noise violation. September 2022, parking violation. She keeps reading. Then she stops. She looks at the page. Her face goes pale. She says, wait. This is not right. Linda stands up and says, let me see that. Heather clutches the folder to her chest. Linda walks over and takes it from her. She looks at the page and says, this is a complaint log entry dated March 2022. The submitter field says Heather Evans. Heather says, that is a mistake. Linda says, it is not a mistake. Your name is on every single entry in this folder. The room goes silent. Heather says, I was filing complaints on behalf of anonymous neighbors. Linda says, you were filing fake complaints and issuing fines to yourself. Heather says, that is not true. Linda hands the folder to Ron. He reads it and says, Heather, this shows you as the submitter on over 40 complaints in the last 3 years. Heather says, I was doing my job. Ron says, your job is to enforce the rules, not invent violations. Heather says, I did not invent anything. Ron says, then explain why so many of these complaints are marked paid when the homeowners say they never paid them. Heather does not answer. She turns and grabs the file cart. She tries to wheel it toward the door. The cart tips over and folders spill across the floor. Papers scatter everywhere. Heather drops to her knees and starts grabbing pages. She says, you are all going to regret this. I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized. Ron says, Heather, you need to leave. Heather stands up and says, I am not leaving. Ron says, if you do not leave, I will call the sheriff. Heather glares at him. Then she looks at me. She says, you did this. I say, you did this to yourself. She picks up the file cart, still half full of folders, and drags it toward the door. She stops at the threshold and says, this is not over. Then she walks out. The room stays silent for a moment. Then someone starts clapping. The applause spreads. Ron says the board will meet in executive session next week to finalize the refund process. If you believe you were improperly fined, please submit a written request to the management company. Meeting adjourned. I walk outside and find Linda and Carl waiting by my van. Linda says, "That was insane." Carl says, "I have never seen anything like it." I say, "I walked away on purpose because I wanted her to follow and say more. I knew she would not be able to help herself." Linda says, "You recorded the whole thing." I say, "Every second." Carl says, "What happens now?" I say, "The board will process the refunds. The detective will review the fraud complaint. Heather is done." Linda says, "Good." 2 weeks later, I get a check in the mail. It is a refund of fees that hits the ledger like a slap. The amount is $850. That is more than I was fined. I call Mark Chen and ask why. He says, "We reviewed the complaint log and found 5 fake fines issued against your property over 3 years. The board voted to refund all of them with interest." I say, "What about the other homeowners?" He says, 37 refunds have been issued. The total is over $14,000. I say, "What happens to Heather?" He says, "The board filed a complaint with the state regulator. She is banned from serving on any HOA board in Washington. The district attorney is reviewing the fraud complaint." I say, "Will there be criminal charges?" He says, "That is up to them." A month later, I get a call from the detective assigned to my case. He says, "I reviewed your evidence and interviewed several witnesses. I am forwarding the case to the prosecutor for charges of theft by deception and obstruction of justice." I say, "What does that mean for me?" He says, "You will likely be called as a witness if it goes to trial." I say, "I will be there." The HOA stops selective enforcement after complaints pile up. The new community standards chair is a calm, fair woman named Rachel, who sends out a newsletter listing every rule and the exact citation in the covenants. She also posts a complaint form on the portal that requires a signature and contact information. Anonymous complaints are no longer accepted. The board votes to hire an independent auditor to review the financials for the last 5 years. The audit finds $22,000 in unexplained expenses tied to the towing vendor. The board files a lawsuit against the vendor and Heather for kickbacks. The case is pending. Heather storms out when the vote goes against her and everyone sees it. She moves out of the neighborhood 2 months later. I see the moving truck in her driveway one Saturday morning. I do not say anything. I just watch her load boxes into the truck and drive away. Carl walks over and says, "Good riddance." Linda texts me and says, "We won." I reply and say, "Yes, we did." 6 months later, I get a letter from the district attorney. Heather Evans has been charged with theft by deception, obstruction of justice, and abuse of office. The trial is scheduled for March. I am listed as a witness. I call Greg Tanaka and say, "It is really happening." He says, "You did the work. You gathered the proof. You stood up when no one else would." I say, "I just wanted to park my van in my driveway." He says, "And now you can." The trial lasts 3 days. I testify on day 2. I bring the binder. The prosecutor walks me through every document. Heather sits at the defense table and does not look at me. The jury deliberates for 4 hours. They find her guilty on all counts. She is sentenced to 6 months in jail, 3 years probation, and ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and the affected homeowners. The judge says, "You abused a position of trust for personal gain." That is unacceptable. I walk out of the courtroom and feel something I have not felt in a long time: peace. I drive home and park my van in my driveway. I look at the house and think about everything that happened. The fight was hard, but it was worth it. I sit in the van for a minute, then I get out and walk inside. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.